Well, so I'd like to start today by examining this topic here. In my talk today, I've entitled Lively Creatures, Animals, and the Italian Recipe Tradition, and the recipe tradition of early modern Italy. And I really want to start with quite an evocative sort of image of early modern kitchen work. And this is this scene completed in 1570 by the Italian artist Vincenzo Campi, which celebrates really the quite chaotic workspace of the kitchen, and it bustles with all kinds of activity. Beyond the host of servants laboring over the meal, a really vast collection of animals, alive and dead, populate the scene. A butchered deer carcass hangs in the back corner, uncooked game birds litter the table, a small boy inflates an animal's bladder, and a cat and a dog sort of scruffle over these plucked animal entrails. And while, of course, exaggerated for effect, it really points to some of the many places that animals occupied in early modern domestic life. And it also really importantly depicts these animals with quite palpable vitality, underlining the fact that these are or were once living creatures. Today, I'm going to speak further about the importance of animal vitality in early modern kitchen work, not in cuisine and cooking, but in the practice of medicine making. Now, in Italy, over the course of the 16th century, domestic medical work really increased in popularity, particularly amongst elites with a growing interest in collecting and testing medical recipes. This work, which was very much related to the Italian tradition of books of secrets, and sort of these notable authorial characters such as Alessio Piedmontese or Isabella Cortese. Like these printed authors, domestic practitioners compiled their own books of trusted recipes. The surprising variety of animal ingredients recorded in these domestic manuscripts demonstrate the popularity and acceptance of animals and their bodies as medical objects. These writings are filled with graphic descriptions of procuring, producing, and using bodily materials towards this ultimate aim of preserving human life. And really, animals of all kind are identified in this insatiable hunt for ingredients, often bled, skinned, or sort of plucked alive in episodes of household violence that provided for a vast number of medical uses. Human bodies, too, were mined for medical supplies, such as breast milk, placenta, urine, and more shockingly, blood, fat, flesh, and bone. Listed here is just a sort of snapshot of some of the ingredients I've come across in recipes. And you'll note that some of these are particularly descriptive. A young boy's water, dead man's skull violently killed, a puppy dog of 9 days old, breast milk of a woman with a son or a daughter. And this is the language that the recipes themselves use with these, descriptive terms. And it's so their vocabulary, their terminology. And these ingredients were used in animal-based recipes, which is what I want to focus today on. And animal-based recipes means recipes in which the primary ingredient is an animal, or the total proportion of ingredients is more than half made up of animal ingredients. And we can see a few examples of what animal-based recipes actually look like in, for example, a series of cosmetic recipes from a 16th century anonymous recipe book. One recipe for removing body hair instructed the following, quote, to make hair fall out. Take a green frog and burn it and make a powder of it, and put this powder in your bath, and wash yourself with it so that the hairs fall out. Another similar one also instructed to smear the head with either the blood of a bat or the milk of a dog. Another still, to make hair grow, instructed the reader to, quote, catch some small mice that still don't have fur, boil them with olive oil till they are destroyed, end quote. And then the recipe goes on to describe how to massage that oil into the head. So while it may be tempting to dismiss these kinds of ingredients as somewhat fantastical, it's worth questioning seriously why recipes of this kind exist and how they reflect real attitudes and assumptions of medical practitioners. It's also important to think about the actors and the spaces of making recipes. In very practical sense, the labors of medicine making were organized both by gender and by status. In elite households of early modern Italy, as well as very widely across Europe, medical care was a domestic task often performed by the lady of the house, who oversaw the health and wellness of her family and her household. In doing so, these women also managed a host of servants and laborers to aid in the practical handwork of making medicines. In this other scene, also from Vincenzo Campi, there's a beautiful illustration of the place of elite women in the space of the kitchen amongst their servants. And although we have here another kitchen scene, it's really important to remember that this is also one of the many spaces of medicine making that happened in elite households, as well as, spaces that were kind of within the house for recovery, for treatment, and a host of outdoor spaces as well, where some of the more dirty work, for instance, butchering, could also be accomplished. This important structure of sort of elite domestic medicine can be glimpsed through a really beautiful example through the recipe book of Anna Maria Luisa de' Medici, which is a really revealing domestic collection of early modern medical recipes. And this is an important case study that we'll talk a little bit about today, and it's one of the primary documents that will help ground some of the themes that I'll introduce. Now, Anna Maria was the only daughter of Cosimo de' Medici, the Grand Duke of Tuscany, and also Electress Palatine upon her marriage to Johann Wilhelm. Her recipe book was begun in the early 18th century, sometime upon her return to Florence after the death of her husband in 1716. While the written collection it's somewhat unassuming in this kind of plain, unadorned collection of some loose 200 recipes, the content of the recipes themselves really display Anna Maria's privileged position within the Florentine court. And this is because the collection contains diverse recipes for a range of interests, including medicine, cosmetics, alchemy, and cookery. It also contains a really high proportion of luxury and internationally imported ingredients, both animal and human. Written as well in Italian, Latin, French, and Spanish, the recipe book offers a notable global perspective, reflecting the extensive sort of networks of the Medici. Ashley Buchanan has really done wonderful scholarship examining this intersection, this global intersection of this recipe book. However, I want to focus on one specific recipe in this collection. And this is a recipe to make a powder against the falling sickness, or also described as the periodic fever, kind of early modern terms for what we might consider epilepsy. Like many of her other remedies, this specific one includes rare luxury ingredients, the highest proportion of which was dead man's skull, which means human skull. The recipe specifies, quote, to take the granules of human skull of a man who died violently and that has not been buried, end quote. It also, amongst this, lists pearl, red coral, white coral, amber, and peony, and instructs the reader to beat all of these together into a very fine powder. And although human skull and its various derivatives appear with relative frequency in the medical culture of early modern Europe, Anna Maria Luisa's description is notable for a number of reasons. Firstly, her expression of a man who died violently is really interesting, and it expressly centers violence as an important actors category, and that recognizes that early modern medical practitioners actively identified certain treatment against animals and humans as inherently violent. Based on the use of this language in the context of making domestic recipes, it also positions violence as medically valuable, as capable of transforming or intensifying the healing virtues of a given substance. Lastly, it also introduces the idea that the body's treatment after death too impacts its medical value, opening up questions about how dishonor, shame, and the desecration of the body too comes to underpin early modern notions of medical theory. Now, in my talk today, I'll be exploring this complicated array of ideas and values, questioning their origins, applications, and supporting theory in medical culture of early modern Italy, as well as looking at a few examples of Europe more broadly. However, to do so, we must look beyond this moment, this 18th century moment, and look further back into the recipe tradition of the 16th and 17th centuries. Within this milieu, human skull, known commonly as dead man's skull, belongs to the category of animal-based ingredients. And although human ingredients have encouraged a special curiosity amongst scholars as well as, public audiences alike, my interest here is to firmly situate these kinds of provocative medical ingredients within the parameters of animal ingredients in general. And what I hope to demonstrate is that objects like dead man's skull are not merely a kind of medical novelty, but rather fit within a world of medical theory and practice that saw the vitality of the body and the soul as intrinsically linked to a remedy's efficacy and potency. As a mirror to the example of dead man's skull, I'll discuss a parallel ingredient, emerges somewhat unexpectedly in these recipes, and that's the case of using dogs or using puppies to make certain kinds of remedies. Looking more broadly at the category of animal ingredients certainly reveals a trade not just in flesh and bone, but in the life force that once animated it. Animals, insects, and human ingredients are identified in recipes, and many are really notably described to be taken alive and processed in particularly violent, painful, and torturous ways, as an almost extractive process that can harvest that same vitality that once animated it and then transfer it to the living sufferer. On a sort of final note, I will conclude with a brief discussion of recipes for poisons, a topic that most certainly captured the interests of domestic Italian recipe collectors, as well as one that reveals this interest in aggravating and distressing the animals in question. However, to investigate how Anna Maria's recipe comes to explain dead man's skull in such descriptive terms, it's really useful to start with a larger examination of recipes for the falling sickness. Early modern recipes for this disease, otherwise known by terms such as convulsions, seizures, the mother's sickness, or again, epilepsy, consistently called for animal and human ingredients. The disease itself is cyclical and recurrent, defined by repeated bouts of seizures over a period of the patient's lifetime, sometimes in perpetuity. In sheer numbers, recipes to treat the falling sickness make up a proportionally high percentage of recipe entries in domestic collections, particularly for children. It's a disease of really near magical proportions, often linked to these ideas of lunacy or possession, of madness, as seen as this, evocative image here. And it's also therefore a useful starting point for investigating, again, these notions of vitality, potency, and the human and animal life force. Now, the most common animal-based ingredient used to treat the falling sickness included various forms of powdered bone, such as deer horn or rhinoceros horn. Sometimes unicorn horn is listed, which would normally mean something like rhinoceros horn, as well, of course, dead man's skull. Contemporary pharmacopoeia similarly noted the benefits of such ingredients to treat disorders of fits. Such ideas and practices enjoyed a wider circulation, both within the Italian tradition itself, as well as more broadly throughout continental Europe. For instance, the early 17th century recipe book of Giulio Boninsegna, first begun in 1617, provides a great example of the popularity of these kinds of ingredients. For instance, in 5 out of the 6 recipes for the falling sickness, it lists human skull in either the highest or the second highest proportion. In artistic works as well, the skull was a popular motif in illustrations of professional pharmacy, or as pictured here in a sort of barber-surgeon working space. In form and content, the recipe book of Boninsegna is also an important moment in that it represents interaction between professional and domestic practice. This is because it's a gifted copy. And I don't have an image of it, unfortunately, but it's quite beautifully decorated with these beautiful dedicatory pages, and it was prepared and presented by Bonensenia himself, who he identifies himself as an apothecary, and it becomes a gifted copy to be given to elites as a form of securing patronage. What we can therefore understand is that the ingredients listed in this collection reflect more so the practice of professional pharmacy, but it also really interestingly demonstrates how they were transformed to the domestic sphere through the culture of gifting and patronage, and specifically how it's transferred to an elite domestic sphere as well. This process of exchange helps to understand the truly porous boundaries of domestic medicine, which did pull heavily from professional medicine, as well as other artisanal and craft practices, again, pulling from spaces and publications such as books of secrets and things of this nature. Now, along this line, I've come across a series of anonymous recipe books of an unclear origin, but certainly some of them have connections to craft, to artisans and craft practices, and some of them are domestic copies. And they include various entries for the falling sickness. Together with the prevalence of human and animal bone in these works, dogs or puppies appear with some frequency as well. And I've pictured here another image which helps us to imagine both the place of dogs in some of these, workspaces, medical workspaces or domestic spaces, and also offers an important reminder to us that these are living, breathing animals, or at one point were. So for instance, I have a selection of recipes for the falling sickness from a 16th century domestic recipe book, which offers an interesting example of recipes that do use canine body parts as a primary ingredient. One of the recipes, in fact, combines this all-important dog with dead man's skull as well as peony, which is a particularly popular herbal ingredient used to treat the falling sickness. And this recipe goes as, quote, "Take finely powdered peony, take the bones of a man's head or a dead woman, if it is a male patient, take a male skull, and similarly, if it is a female, scrape it well with a knife and take the skin of a dog, and finally mince these three things and mix them together. Then give them to the sick person in the evening and in the morning in broth, and certainly he will recover." Like many recipes for the falling sickness, powdered peony and human bone are used, yet the inclusion of minced dog skin is somewhat unusual. And I certainly think it's included because of its fat content, as the fat of dogs was considered to be hot in the third degree according to contemporary pharmacopoeia across Europe, such as the Pharmacopoeia Londinensis by Nicholas Culpeper, and it's also referenced in other, for instance, Italian pharmacopoeia, the Ricettario Fiorentino. And we then might ask, is this recipe trying to create a warming effect, especially as some contemporary medical writers argued that the falling sickness was a disorder of the blood caused by an overabundance of black bile, which was considered cold. So perhaps these warm, wet concoctions were an attempt to warm and balance the humors. I also too have a second recipe from the same collection that specifies the importance of the dog's condition. And this is a very interesting one. So it reads as follows, quote, "Take a small female dog. The smaller it is, the better it is. And if it is pregnant, and if you want to make it for a female, take the first female puppy that the dog births, and make sure that it does not take any food. And if for a man, take the first male puppy. Make sure that it does not take any food. Put it into a new pot to boil, and as you take it, boil it so that the bones, skin, and hair are well consumed and broken down as possible. And then take as many handfuls of spice as you can get, as much as you think. Take 2 additional fresh eggs, and from that decoction make a tortello, and the sick person eats it, and he will recover without a doubt." Directing the reader to make a rich broth of what is essentially boiled puppy, bones, skin, and all, this recipe offers an unusual variance on more traditional methods of making restorative foods, which more often made use of animals like chickens or capons. In this case, the puppy broth is then incorporated into a kind of dough to be fed to the infirmed. This recipe very much straddles the line between food and medicine, employing simple cooking techniques and tools. However, what is particularly intriguing is the question of the animal's age, and by extension, its perceived vitality and usefulness as a medical ingredient. For instance, the terminology puppy is clear. In emphasizing the animal's desired youth, the recipe implies the puppy is to be newborn, taken immediately after birth before it has been nursed by its mother. It's curious as well that the recipe insists that the puppy not take any nourishment, be denied food, and this is an idea I'll return to in just a few moments. Without a doubt, though, this puppy, the young puppy, is to be used promptly and alive, presumably boiled while still living. These qualities thus appear integral to the efficacy of the recipe, as this almost distillation-like process seemingly transferred the puppy's youth and vital life force into the concoction itself. Therefore, we might identify boiling alive as one of the ideal methods of animal processing, one of those potentially deemed violent by early modern practitioners. In addition to this kind of treatment, another method appears which more expressly describes the use of violence and links the medical preparation of puppies with that of dead man's skull. And this method is strangulation, which is sporadically referenced by recipes across early modern Europe. For instance, the desire for material harvested after a violent death was also repeated in English recipe books, which sometimes qualified dead man's skull in terms of manner of death. For instance, one unauthored recipe collection from the mid-17th century recommended, quote, "The skull of a person strangled or put to any violent death is much better than theirs who die of any disease," end quote, meaning very much that it is best to have the skull of a person who has been strangled, who has been killed violently, and that this is expressly better than someone who succumbs to a natural death or a death by disease. Another kind of recipe from the 17th century in England also instructed the reader to take the moss of a skull of a man who has, quote, "been strangled." Recipes likewise instructed their readers to asphyxiate animals. For instance, one called to strangle a hare as in a rabbit, and another to stifle a hen. However, before the creation of these English compendiums, we can find these patterns in the Italian recipe tradition, in which strangulation appears, albeit quite rarely. As an example, a very curious recipe from the 1555 edition of Alessio Piedmontese's famous Book of Secrets includes this provision in his description of an oil of red dog. The recipe begins, quote, "Take a red-furred dog that is not old and keep it for 3 days without eating. Then, with a rope around the neck, strangle it, and when thus dead, leave it for a quarter of an hour." End quote. The text moves on to instruct how to boil the dog's body whole until it is well cooked and dissolved, much like the recipe we just saw. It also prescribed the addition of 80 to 100 scorpions and instructed to distill the decoction with sambuca and various herbs. The resulting remedy was supposedly so powerful that the author attests to its, quote, "miraculous virtue" in healing a priest, as well as in, quote, "many other experiences." Like the previous recipe, this one instructs the reader also not to feed this poor animal, this time for a period of 3 full days. Yet another recipe from a 15th century Italian domestic recipe book also called for the tooth of a hungry dog, suggesting the wider prevalence of these ideas and the idea of a kind of hungry dog or starving a dog to make some of these medicines. And certainly it opens the question of why. Is this a means to purify the body of the dog, or is it also treatment inflicted to induce anxiety, fear, and pain? I will say it's unclear in the source material. Why such recipes so expressly, though, lauded the medical virtues of strangulation, this is also difficult to discern. However, we do have considerably more clues. In the case of the falling sickness, some recipe writers linked the bodies of strangled victims with the pathology of the disease as a result of the early modern doctrine of cosmic sympathies, in which the properties of material ingredients were connected to specific diseases through various analogies or believed similarities. For instance, the special physical qualities of strangled human skull, its signatures, as it might be called by medieval and early modern contemporaries, were believed to be in correspondence with the disease based on their likenesses. As an example, Oswald Kroll presented Dead Man's Skull and described it as Dead Man's Skull of an unburied man in his treatment for the falling sickness, stating that the skull, quote, of those that are strangled is a most excellent remedy, end quote. He also specified how and why Dead Man's Skull matched the signatures of the falling sickness, arguing that the skull of a man strangled was the same as the skull of an epileptic, quote, because in the epileptic fit, the patient laboring there within is almost strangled, and the spirit of life included, seeking passage out, is suffocated, end quote. This analogy connected the experience of the epileptic fit with death by asphyxiation. It was also underpinned by the assumption that strangulation captured the life force of a living being. Thus, trapped in the very bones of the skull, Kroll further seemed to suggest that the extinguished vitality of the strangled person is materially captured and can thus be transferred to the living sufferer by consuming that same material. And an actual description of how to prepare human bodies into the ingredient called mumia, meaning mummy, sometimes also even described as Egyptian mummy. Kroll's well-cited recipe to make treacle of mummy is equally explicit. And he goes on to describe, quote, choose the carcass of a red man, whole clear without blemish, of the age of 24 years, that hath been hanged, broke upon a wheel, or thrust through, having been for one day and night exposed to the open air in a serene time, end quote. In addition to this colorful description, Kroll also further explained that the material ought to come from the flesh of a man that perishes, again by violent death, using explicitly that terminology. He also emphasizes that many of these points that are of interest to my talk today, again, that the body ought to come from a young, fit, and healthy man, centering the desire to procure bodily material that is of the highest quality that is judged by these markers of age and health, and thus these markers of the body and the soul's vitality and life force. Importantly, the violent death in question is a quick death, a painful death, an unexpected death. Pain and fear are most certainly experienced by these unlucky victims. And one of the things that seems to be part of the integral process in being able to capture that same vitality. The interest in strangulation and other described methods of death also opens the question of procurement, partly because human-derived ingredients were supposedly taken from condemned criminals, their flesh, bone, hair, and fat harvested and sold by executioners. In this medical market, it is impossible to ignore the connections between strangulation and execution via hanging, one of the most common forms of punishment. In these cases, it's also curious that the recipes state the bone ought to come from an unburied body, much like Anna Maria's recipe. And it ultimately prescribes a corpse doubly violated, murdered, and then unburied. While the precise reason for this directive is unclear, I would certainly suggest that this is not simply a reflection of easy availability, and instead more likely represents a complex symbiotic relationship in which execution both creates availability in and of itself and creates a desirable medical product in which the manner of death and the body's treatment afterwards was believed to have an important material effect. Now, returning to our examples of dogs in which there is an instruction to to treat the animal and to prepare it in similar ways really helps to ground these human-based recipes within a broader practice that bartered and sold a medical ingredient created through violence. violence that similarly enhanced and extracted the medical virtues of living beings. While a character like Kroll seems to suggest the violence of asphyxiation creates a purely embodied effect, what if we take seriously as well this idea that animal and human treatment was designed to create both an embodied and an emotional impact? And we might catch glimpses of this feature by shifting gears a little and by turning our attention away from the falling sickness and towards another class of recipes altogether, that is poisons and poison antidotes. Now, recipes for poisons are very well represented in domestic Italian recipe collections. And they're also a very useful category of recipes from which to deepen many of the themes we've been discussing here for a number of reasons. Firstly, unlike other recipe products, poisons tend to use a higher concentration of animal-based ingredients, largely coming from poisonous creatures such as snakes, frogs, lizards, and spiders. Secondly, poisons are a specific kind of animal byproduct that is not readily available or easily gathered from the animal itself. Poisons are therefore a more elusive animal byproduct that demanded creative techniques of collection, dissimilar from other byproducts such as hair, saliva, urine, excrement, or milk, which are either expelled from the body naturally or generally more easily gathered. Lastly, early moderns conceived of poisons as being both harmful and healthful substances, believing that the same material which inflicted the harm could also be harnessed to reverse it. Now, a recipe book with a particularly large collection of poisons and poison antidote recipes comes from the 17th century Ricettario Bardi, and it contains a total of 13 recipes for poisons, only 2 of which do not contain at all any animal ingredients. One of the recipes of particular note is as follows, quote, "On hot days, take a large and lively scorpion and 1 spider of the black kind, which are poisonous, and place them on a plate and cover them with the glass you want to poison. And then place the plate 3 feet above the embers with a slow fire, so that the animals will bite each other and fight, and soon they will die and leave the poison in that glass. Fill it with wine, and you will see well that he who drinks it will die without showing any signs. And be aware that even if you wash the glass well with water or something else, in any case, it will not lose the poison, and it is without a remedy." Forcing the live scorpion and spider to fight over a hot plate, the animals are subjected to particularly harsh treatment. The provision to use lively scorpions, repeated also in many recipes for poisons across Italian recipes, suggests the ways that these compilers conceived of animal vitality as being an integral quality of the animal material to be actively measured and captured. In this sense, it importantly parallels descriptions that we've already seen in the case of Dead Man's Skull and Puppy, in which liveliness is an integral feature of selecting and using living creatures to be made into medicines. Another recipe in this same collection calls for an even more diverse cast of fighting animals. And it instructs, quote, "Take a viper, an asp, a green lizard, a toad, scorpions, and black cobwebs, everything alive, and put them in a pot, and on top put another pot, and seal the joints. And in the pot where the said animals are, put some salt, and you will make some small holes so that the animals do not suffocate. But said holes will be better in the pot above. And then you will put them in the hot ash so that the animals, feeling the heat, will bite each other, and they will leave the poison in the said salt, which will remain poisoned with deadly poison." The goal in both of these recipes is for the animals to fight one another. But is this simply an extractive technique, allowing them to drain themselves of their poisons, or is it perhaps meant to influence the emotional state of the animal? I suggest that there is this emotional or psychological state to the animal that does matter and that does help to underpin the perceived efficacy of their bodies, and helps to explain why they're included with such careful descriptions in these kinds of recipes. Like those violently killed in recipes against, the falling sickness, the desire is for the animal ingredient to be derived from subjects that have undergone extreme duress in the form of pain, of anger, of fear. A hint to perhaps better understand this phenomenon comes from Mattioli's Oil of Scorpions, which is quite, famous, in which he writes, quote, "Then have 300 live scorpions caught on hot days and place them in a glass bowl over the hot ash. And as you can see, they will sweat due to the heat and become enraged." So this is really interesting. Unlike other recipes that I've come across, this version specifically states that the animals will become enraged. The goal then, in this example, is made explicitly clear to force a specific emotional state on the scorpions in their last moments of life. And this comes to be one of the recipes that is quite popular and becomes very well circulated throughout these networks of trading recipes between both professional medical practitioners as well as domestic practitioners, really of all kinds. And so many of these themes are reiterated. Lastly, the sort of practical reality of making these kinds of recipes also calls into question the way that practitioners engaged with nature. Many of these recipes include the provision that the scorpions are to be taken alive and specifically on hot days. Um, and it opens again this question of how or when they're to be found. And they don't all necessarily elucidate whether the animal can be found in the wild or whether it is to be sourced domestically within the immediate household environment. It's likely that in a number of locations in Italy, where some species of scorpions are native, they could have been found in both locations, in the household or in sort of an environmental sort of nearby environment. Certainly, the recipes do imply a readily available population of live scorpions that can be easily accessed by practitioners at need. In other examples, for instance, another recipe from the same collection provides more immediate information, saying, quote, the scorpions want to be caught on hot days, and they want to be lively and taken in mountainous places, end quote. So certainly professionals would have had suppliers. For instance, the Medici Fonderia in Ducal Florence imported huge quantities of scorpions, really by the hundreds, to make the famous Medici antidote. Nonetheless, we have here hints of an important knowledge of where and when to catch live scorpions, and it illuminates an additional use of the recipe genre to investigate animal nature. Although it's unlikely that the author of this recipe physically caught the scorpions by their own hand, the text trades both in recipe knowledge and in knowledge of animal behavior and natural ecologies. In conversation with all of the previous recipes, it's clear that there is a practical application to this knowledge, for instance, in being able to provoke the animal to certain action by understanding its response to stimuli like heat. In conclusion, then, we might linger on the utility of violence in making recipes and on the interest in capturing and using animal and human bodies in vital, lively states. From newborn puppy to executed criminal to poisonous toads, vipers, and scorpions, the inclusion of these kinds of almost fantastical ingredients has often undermined the broader legitimacy of animal-based ingredients in the practice of early modern medicine. However, if we take recipe writers' descriptions of successful remedies and potent ingredients seriously, we find that many recipes promoted narratives of efficacy that maintain a sound medical logic, according to early modern concepts of the body and of disease. In doing so, we can trace a continuum through these seemingly dissimilar materials to sharpen our vantage into a world of animal-based medicines. And I hope today that I've offered a glimpse into this realm of domestic medicine, which I do hope you all found interesting and which I think is an important aspect to continue studying to broaden our understanding of the types of ingredients that are used in medicine making.